Thank you very much for having me. If I can arm you intellectually for your Thanksgiving feasts, it's a mitzvah. So I'm very happy to do that. So, the book that I'm working on right now is about global economic governance. What is global economic governance? It's a very fancy term. What I'm referring to here are the set of formal and informal institutions at both the global and national level that basically write the rules of the game for cross-border exchange. Now, some of these institutions you've heard of, the World Trade Organization with respect for trade. Some of these institutions some of you have heard of, like let's say the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. And then some of them you've never heard of, like the Financial Action Task Force on Money Laundering. And if you have heard of that, well, then you're probably in some trouble. Now, I'm writing about global economic governance after 2008. The problem is that the conventional wisdom, even before the 2008 financial crisis, sort of resembled a joke that Woody Allen told in Annie Hall, in which two women are at a resort in the Catskills. And one woman says to the other, "God, the food here is so horrible." And the other woman responds, "I know, in such small portions." In essence, this was the conventional wisdom about global economic governance, which was it was producing lousy policy, and also it wasn't nearly enough. And there's reason to believe this. There were justified reasons to argue for this. You know, in the International Monetary Fund, in the run-up to the crisis, one of the issues was that clearly China was undervaluing its currency. That would have been an appropriate topic for conversation at the IMF Executive Board. Except China essentially vetoed any conversation about this at the IMF. So as a result, even though they knew it was a problem, they couldn't do anything about it. Then there's sclerosis. At the World Trade Organization, they launched an ambitious trade round in Doha in 2001. By 2008, essentially the trade round had been put in the deep freeze because there were too many veto players that could essentially deep six a deal. Then there was just stupidity. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision created a set of core banking standards called Basel II. And in this case, the sequel was definitely worse than the original. Essentially, those codes and standards encourage pro-cyclicality among banks, encouraging them to lend way too much, particularly in Europe. And then finally, there was just sheer offensiveness. So for example, the G8 grouping, the group of 8 countries, generally thought to be the most powerful countries in the world. By the middle of last decade, it had begun to occur to them that the BRIC economies, Brazil, India, and China, probably should be brought to that table, maybe to talk about a few important things. So they came up with the genius idea of maybe having a dinner the night before where the leaders of Brazil and India and China could sit, and then they would be sent away, and then they could have the real adult conversation afterwards. Which actually reminded me of when I would be a college student, go home for Thanksgiving and be forced to sit at the kiddie table. And furthermore, once the 2008 financial crisis hit, it was pretty serious. Now, the graph you're seeing right now compares how well the global economy did in terms of trade levels in 2008 compared to what happened in 1929 when the stock market crashed. The blue line is the Great Depression. The red line is what happened after 2008. What you discover is that basically for the first year after the 2008 financial crisis, the drop in trade, the drop in industrial output, and the drop in stock market capitalization all exceeded what happened in 1929. So the initial shock in 2008 was actually worse than the Great Depression. And since the 2008 financial crisis, a whole host of books have been published basically arguing that global economic governance is broken or gridlocked or leaderless or what have you. And most of these books make one of two kinds of arguments. The first is that we're in some kind of power transition. That much like the interwar period when Great Britain was the hegemon, the United States was a rising power, but it refused to do anything. Now we're in a world where it's the United States that's the tired, aging hegemon, and China, which is the resurgent challenger, but nonetheless unwilling to contribute. But some people go further. Some people argue, no, it's not that just we're in a power transition. We're actually seeing power diffusing. The fact is, presidents aren't what they used to be. You know, we're operating in a world where Edward Snowden can leak something and manage to somehow sabotage a transatlantic trade deal. In a world of WikiLeaks and global civil society, maybe presidents or politicians can't do much anymore. And maybe we're really sliding into a world of chaos or entropy or something worse. Obviously, basically, the book that I'm writing, which will come out in June of next year, argues that everything that I just told you is wrong. That in fact, or at least in the last minute I told you is wrong. In essence, what I'm arguing is that despite an initial shock that was far worse than what happened in 1929, in fact, global economic governance managed to contain the damage. And in fact, it could have been far worse, but it wasn't. And that in fact, the system worked. That despite a lot of genuine reasons for skepticism, multilateral economic institutions actually did their job after 2008. Now, that's a pretty grandiose claim. How do I tell? Well, the book takes a look at 3 different levels. First, how does the global economy perform after 2008? Do you see comebacks in terms of industrial output, economic output, trade, foreign direct investment, and so forth? But it's possible that the global economy can heal itself in spite of rather than because of what global economic governance does. God knows we can imagine politicians making mistakes a fair amount. So I also look to see whether or not policymakers pursued policies that you would expect to see in a financial crisis as a way to contain the damage. And the final level I look at is whether or not these international governance structures manage to reallocate power to have the BRIC economies, for example, be given a greater voice. This is particularly important because, in essence, reallocating power inside an international institution is a zero-sum game. If you're going to give China a greater voice, it means you're giving Germany a lesser voice, and they're not necessarily going to like it. So if they agree to it, it's got to mean that global economic governance might actually be working. So the key thing to realize is that what happened in 2008 was truly unique for the last 80 years in 2 ways. First, it was a massive financial crisis, but second, it was global in scope. Most of the post-war recessions, even those that involved a serious financial crisis, were limited to one country or one region. You have to go back to 1929 to talk about a period where, in fact, the global economy faced that much of a systemic shock. And the fact is, if you take a look at the graphs, the system worked remarkably well. Despite an initial shock, both industrial output and trade are now 10% higher than they were in 2008. In contrast, during the Great Depression, trade was at 1/3 the level, and so was industrial output. Furthermore, this growth has been poverty reducing. If you take a look at human development indicators, what you actually see is an increase in the reduction of poverty over the last 12 years as opposed to what we thought of as the boom times of the 1990s, which is pretty significant. Well, maybe that was in spite of rather than because of policymakers. Well, the 2 things that policymakers have to do during a financial crisis is first inject liquidity into the system. And even the skeptics about global governance admit that that certainly happened. The other thing they have to do is keep trade barriers open. And this is the particularly sort of contrary to conventional wisdom. There were a lot of fears of a rise of Smoot-Hawley, too. And yet if you actually take a look at tariff levels either stayed the same or went down after 2008. But governments are crafty. They can come up with other things like non-tariff barriers. Maybe they instituted things like anti-dumping rules or quotas or what have you. And there was a modest bump in them. But what's interesting is that the modest bump in them actually paled behind the non-tariff barriers that existed 10 years ago. And furthermore, 5 years into the financial crisis, the number of non-tariff barriers are actually at their lowest level in the history of the World Trade Organization, which is quite astonishing. So the question is, why does the system work? Well, I'm running out of time according to this thing, so I can't tell you. But in the book, I take a look at sort of the bread and butter, the building blocks of international relations theory, namely interests, ideas, and power. In terms of interest, globalization, in terms of the global supply chain, and in terms of financial interdependence, has basically reworked interest groups that traditionally would have advocated for sort of brute protectionism, now actually have a stake in the system maintaining open. In terms of ideas, 2008 could have been a moment where there was a rejection of the Washington consensus, or free market capitalism, or neoliberalism. It depends on whatever label you want to use. But the one country that could have done this was China. And what's interesting about China after 2008 is that China doesn't act like a spoiler in the system. Instead, it actually acts like a responsible stakeholder. They refrained. In fact, if anything, China's economy after 2008, in terms of their policy, starts moving towards the Washington consensus, not away from it. And then finally, power. And this is perhaps the biggest misperception. This is a chart that shows the sort of shares of global economic output. The top 2 lines, the blue one is the European Union, the red one is the United States. The bottom lines are the BRIC economies. The green one is China. Now, there's no doubt that China is rising. But the important thing is they're rising from a really low level, and it's going to take a really long time for them to catch up to the United States, if they ever actually do so. China faces what's called a middle income trap, which in all likelihood means their growth is going to taper off rather than continue at double-digit rates. So finally, let me close with a very important slide. I cannot tell you how petrified I am that I'm making this argument that the system worked, because I have to wait until June for the book to come out. And I don't mean to say, therefore, everything is hunky-dory. What I'm trying to say is that it could have been much, much worse. Without U.S. leadership, China's supportership, and more generally the function of these institutions, the system actually did work. And instead of facing a second Great Depression, we faced essentially the economic equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis and walked away standing. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.